everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and welcome to night 2 of the 2023 ChemKnits Chanukah special. This year we are chasing joy, and another of my joyful moments this year was dyeing some yarn with resists and some fluorescent neon pops. And I wanted to emulate this type of colorway, but a little bit differently tonight. In addition to our resist colorway, we will also be dyeing a tonal black yarn to go with this color. So that way you could blend the two together to spread out these neon pops a little bit more, or play with it in a lot of different ways. And this tonal black is the second bonus 10-gram mini skein for this year's sampler. So let's get started with dyeing this tonal black skein, and then we will talk more about our resist project. I put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves to start measuring out dye powder to dye our yarn a 2% depth of shade, which is the equivalent of 2 grams of dye per 100 grams of yarn. Since we're dyeing 1,300 grams of yarn today, we're going to need 26 grams of black dye total. And I have both toner black and true black here because I didn't know if I had 26 grams left of either one. And so why not go 50-50 with the 2 blacks from Dharma's Acid Dye collection? After measuring out 13 grams of each color, I divided the dye up a little bit so that way it would be a little easier to dissolve, and dissolved the dye in some hot tap water. And while I wasn't worried about the total volume of dye that we would need here today, I did take care to keep the true black separate from the toner black because we're going to dye our yarn in a 2-step cold process technique. I pre-soaked the 130 10-gram mini skeins of 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon yarn that's in both fingering and DK weights for about an hour in some plain tap water with no acid inside this 5-gallon bucket. Now, while I'm outside, I started removing the yarn from the bucket and just wringing out some of the liquid to set it aside. And then I added 13 grams of our toner black dye into the bucket and sort of stirred things up to make sure it was well dissolved before adding the yarn back in. And then I tried to move the yarn around as much as possible so we could get a really good coverage of the black, even though we're in a fairly crowded situation. Now, the reason why I'm planning on dyeing this yarn in 2 layers is because if there are any light patches from this first round of dyeing, once we go to the second layer, we will be able to sort of shift and add that color in the areas that need it the most. I let the yarn sit with the toner black dye for a little bit with no acid before bringing over about 1 cup of white vinegar. I then removed the yarn and lowered it again to sort of stir things up, trying to sort of break apart the yarn so that way it's not just one massive yarn clump. And then I put the lid back on the container to let it sit for a couple of hours. A few hours later, I used a clear cup to sort of check to see how much color was left in the water. And if there's a little bit of color left, that's not a big deal. We can remove the yarn, sort of shift the zip ties around, so that way we can dye our true black layer. Now, if there was still a lot of pigment left in there, then you could leave the yarn to sit overnight. But honestly, even with a cooler early fall day outside, things tend to strike pretty quickly in my experience. Once I was done adding the true black dye, the 13 grams of true black dye, into the dye bath, stirred things up, added the yarn in, stirred things up, I put the lid back on to let things sit overnight, at least overnight, so we could try to absorb as much of that color as possible. After a couple of days, I checked on the yarn, and it still looked like there was a lot of dye left in the water, which is a little bit of a bummer, but at the same time, I know it's not really that much pigment. If I were to remove all the yarn and put a yarn mop in, even just 100 grams, that yarn would be a gray. It wouldn't be as charcoal / black as the skeins in here will end up. But either way, to heat set this yarn, I decided to do a very crowded immersion dye bath. So I put 7 of the bundles, so 700 grams, into an 8-quart pot, and then added approximately 12 cups of the leftover dye bath from our cool vat into the container. Then I covered the yarn and heat set the yarn for about 45 minutes, just to give the pot time to heat up and hopefully finish setting that color. And then once this first pot is done, I will empty the dye bath, empty the pot, and do the same with the remaining 600 grams of yarn. Again, adding more of that former dye bath to give us the liquid and to help absorb that little bit of color. And with a little bit of dye that's left over in the dye bath, it's time for a yarn mop. Removing the yarn, there was a little bit of red left in the pot, which was interesting to me. So I put a skein of platinum sock into there to soak up that red color. It gave us a really beautiful pale peach that I'm excited to play around with more as we mop up all of these colors. And I will reuse this mop after we do the second round of setting the black that I'm going to do off camera. It doesn't matter that I only set it for 10 minutes now. We will heat set it eventually in the end once I have finished using it. Washing the cooled off black yarn was unremarkable. There was a hint of some gray bleeding, but it resolved quickly and the water was clear, so I was able to put the yarn through my spin dryer, hang it up to dry, and we can move on to the second phase of this project. And that second phase is to dye the second colorway of tonight, where we will be dyeing a black once again, but this time with resist, so that way we can add those neon fluorescent pops of color later on. One big consideration is that I want to try to match the depth of shade of our black on the non-resist areas with our black tonal that we just created. But now we're going to go add the resists onto the yarn. I wanted to create 5 different resist points on this colorway so we could have a dark black background with pops of white where I could add neon fluorescent colors. I do have 6 different fluorescent acid dye colors, but I decided against it because when I did this colorway the first time in a ChemKnits dye along, or this type of colorway at least, I had 5 colors and I debated a lot what kind of rainbow to do. So I'm going to do a few different versions of 5 colors out of the 6 that are available. Not every single combination, but I plan to do a few. I started adding 5 different tight removable nylon zip ties onto a single 100-gram bundle. And then I realized that I wanted the resist points to be a little bit thicker. So I put 2 of the bundles together and then put the zip ties around. And when I got to the very last 100-gram skein, because I'm dyeing an odd number of 100-gram bundles, I folded it in half so most of the resist points could be a little bit thicker, and then there was one that was a little thinner. The pattern on this skein might be slightly different than the others, but I don't know if I'll be able to tell which this lone one was by itself in the end. There have been instances where I noticed color transfer from zip ties onto yarn, and this is not a concern for me today because we are going to be adding color, neon color, onto these resist points anyway, so we'll have an opportunity to cover that up a bit. I decided to pre-soak our resist tied up yarn before we added the black color on. And I decided to do this because if I added all of this yarn dry to our dye bath, we would end up with something patchier, and things are crowded enough that we could end up with some larger undyed patches than what I'm really hoping for. So I used the same 5-gallon bucket that I had used for the black tonal, but I just rinsed it. I didn't really wash it, so there could be a little bit of residual black around the sides or edge. That doesn't matter because we're going to be dyeing this black anyway. And I filled it up with plain tap water and no acid and let the yarn sit for a couple of hours before we started adding dye. Speaking of dye, I put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves and started measuring out more black dye to dye our resist yarn. Now, I could have gone for a 1% depth of shade of each of the 2 blacks, 13 grams of each that I had used the last time. However, since we have some resist, we're technically dyeing less yarn, and so I want to use a bit less dye. Therefore, I measured out 10 grams of each of the black colors for this step. This is a little over 3/4 the amount of dye that we used on that very first tonal. I measured out the dye and dissolved it in hot tap water to get ready to dye this yarn. When it was time to add the dye to the yarn, I had to get a little bit creative because I think it was raining outside. And so normally with these big scale projects, I like to do it outside, not only because we can get some heat from the sun, but also if there's a little bit of exuberant splash, I'm outside, not in my kitchen. So we're gonna try this in my kitchen sink. I removed the pre-soaking yarn and then added in our toner black dye. Stirred up the bucket and then added the yarn back in. I let the yarn sit a little while and then I stirred things. And before adding acid, I brought over our true black dye. I didn't want to remove the yarn, add the dye, and then add the yarn back in because I didn't want to drip black dye all over my kitchen. So I sort of poured the dye around and then stirred things up, knowing that I hadn't added acid to the bucket yet. Then I added a cupful of acid, stirred up the yarn as best I could, and then placed a lid on to set the yarn aside for a couple of days. After 2 days, I removed our resist yarn from the 5-gallon bucket and brought it inside to steam set the yarn. I decided to steam it before removing the resists to add our neon, potentially, not really speckly, but our neon color, because I know we'll be steam setting it once we add the neon dye, but I didn't want there to be transfer from some of the black areas onto those bright areas, so I thought it made sense to really try to set these black colors. Now, of course, I'm not going to be washing this yarn before we do the next step, but at least we will have applied some heat. And we'll remove the zip ties from the yarn once it's cool. But I went ahead and steam set all of the yarn in batches for 30 minutes. And to the 5-gallon bucket, there was some black dye left, so I added 2 yarn mops, 1 Crazy 8 DK, 1 Platinum DK, just to soak up some of that gray color. Don't worry, we'll add some neon to it in a little bit. Let's remove some of these resists. I always find it's a little easiest to push in briefly. Okay, there's a little bit of gray, but it's actually a pretty small little spot. I'm actually fairly impressed with how small this is, given that we had 200 grams together. The longest is not even quite an inch. But I think that's ultimately a good thing for the tiny little neon pop of color. Ooh, oh dear, this one has some where it's extremely dark. That one did not work well at all. Oh, that's a bummer. I've never had one like not work well. Here's another one. I guess I didn't do it tight enough. I mean, it worked a little bit, but oh, this is a shame. It'll still be beautiful. It's just we're not gonna have quite as many pops of color on this set, but we will try. And let's separate these 2 skeins because I'll be dyeing over these one at a time. And so as long as I don't shift the minis from each other, we will be able to see where those areas are supposed to be. And so it might not be super visible, but we should be able to get some color there. I want to grab one more particular set. And this was our solo set. Yeah, again. Yikes. Hey, this goes to show that sometimes things don't work perfectly when I try it. Okay, at least that one worked. I think that some of them I must not have made tight enough because the dye was able to get in. Okay, this one there's a tiny bit of color transfer. There's a hint of some blue on here, but I can either make that blue once I go to dye this yarn or something else. But so like this one section over here has pretty much nothing, and over here, like only about half of them, but there are some that did work fine. So the colorway isn't going to necessarily work exactly as I had intended, but it should work out somewhat. I hope. And you know, the dark areas are dark, but when I'm putting dye powder on here, it will not be visible necessarily, but there might be like a tint to those areas. So there might be a little bit of something. It'll still be beautiful and different from the black tonals. And so I guess that's I'm looking for the silver linings here. I went to go remove the zip ties from the rest of the yarn, and I wasn't sure if this was going to be a fluke where a couple failed on the first ones that I checked, or if I was going to see failure throughout. And I think my error here today was because the way I added this resist yarn to the bucket and moved it so much, that forced some of the dye into that resist area. And if I had had the yarn wet before I added on the resists, then there would have been a little bit more resist because there would have been moisture in those areas, the color wouldn't have wicked in, and maybe not necessarily larger white patches, but some of them wouldn't have, quote, failed as they did. But I am surprised that this had some failure because I do resist dyeing kinds of stuff like this all the time. Maybe also the issue is that I didn't have acid right away, and that allowed some of the dye to move in more. Editing Rebecca might put up a note on the screen for us as she looks back at the conditions that she used. But either way, I know that this yarn is going to be really fun with pops of color, and it'll make them a little more random than they were before. The end result is that some of these skeins have all 5 resist points, some don't. But the ironic thing is that I was planning on doing slightly different colorways on them since I have more than 5 neon colors, and so there were going to be some differences between all the batches, and now there'll be a few more differences between the batches, and so that is amusing me a little bit. But I also think that it's good to just share and show that things don't turn out perfectly for me every time. I have a lot of success, but sometimes there are mistakes, but we'll turn those into happy accidents, and that's our goal today as we're chasing joy this Chanukah. Here are 7 different fluorescent acid dye colors. From Dharma, we have Purple Pop, Fluorescent Lemon, Fluorescent Safety Orange, and Fluorescent Fuchsia. And from Jacquard, we have Blacklight Blue, Chartreuse, Fluorescent Orange, and Fluorescent Red. Now, of all these colors, the Fluorescent Red and Blacklight Blue are unique to Jacquard. Dharma doesn't have an equivalent in their line. Purple Pop is more fluorescent than the closest purple Jacquard offers. The yellows and pinks are pretty much the same. Maybe Dharma's are slightly more pigmented. The greens are different, but I prefer the hue of Chartreuse over Radioactive. It's a little bit bluer, and I really like that. And the 2 oranges are similar in their hue, but they break differently. And so I'm tempted to play around with both of them. I don't think this is going to be a true side-by-side comparison, but artistically, I'm curious to see what I get from both of them. So I'll try to just kind of keep track and make note of it along the way. Now, most of our skeins have spots for 5 colors. So in theory, we could do something like red, pink, orange, yellow, green for 5. Or we could go, you know, purple through orange. We could skip the orange and go to pink. There's other, you know, sort of contiguous rainbow ways that we can go about this. We could go orange all the way through blue and skip the green and the yellow. And so I'm planning on just playing around with different combinations and seeing where we end up. And so that's my goal today. And the fun thing, it means that each of you, when you're unwrapping your mini skein, might have something slightly different. But in all likelihood, I have a feeling that mostly I'd end up using one of the pink, red, or purple, and then use these other 4 colors, is my gut of where I would land. But again, I plan to play. And when we look at the dry yarn, we may not know which colors were used for which sample anymore. And that's okay, because I could also mix them together. I put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves to start mixing our acid dyes with citric acid powder. I set out some plastic containers that each had 1 teaspoon of the more finely milled citric acid powder. And then I added 1 little scoop, which is, I believe, 1/32 of a teaspoon of each of the fluorescent acid dye colors to that citric acid and stirred it together. So that way we would have that acid dye powder coating the citric acid. So then we can then incorporate all these colors onto our yarn. Okay, let's start with one of the sets that worked the best. And on one of them, I'm bringing Jacquard red over. And I'm speckling it on. And I'm curious about how I'm going to feel about this. And then tapping it out. I think I'm going to need to just be way heavier with the powder. There we go. To bring in this red. It's funny because I definitely did this with liquid before, and what's funny is that I might end up changing things up very soon and swapping to liquid depending on how easy or hard this is, because I want my hands to be dry when we go into the containers. But we're going to do purple on this other one. I can always mix up more. I can just go a bit heavier with these powders to spread it out. There was one time I did sort of like a powder and then intentionally rubbing it on the counter kind of way to do the colorways, and I really loved how that turned out. And so, I mean, we'll have to see. It's possible that this will just take a lot longer. Now for Blacklight blue, I did use twice as much dye as I did with the other colors, just because I know it is less pigmented. And I'm going to bring it in onto both, trying to get it over the white sections, but you can see I'm clearly making a mess, but also overshooting it. I did not mix the Blacklight blue with any turquoise or anything here, and there's like next to no color coming out over there. I have a feeling I'm about to add water to each of these jars, and so I don't have enough brushes, I don't think. Because I was like, that might just be easier, which is a shame because I like what I have in my head, but I think for precision's sake and the fact that I need my fingers to be dry each time I go back into the dye, I might be making a much bigger mess trying to use the powder than I would if I was using a liquid, which is ironic. Now the Chartreuse definitely looks very yellow right now because it is yellow. Oh no, there's the green coming out. I was like, whoa, this is broken. Like, this isn't Chartreuse. Like, is that a residual blue on my finger? I am so confused right now. I was like, this is so yellow. Okay, nope, the green in it is coming through more. Oh my gosh. Oh man. You know, sometimes I have a plan and it works perfect. Other times I have a plan and then so I want to do something a little different, and then I'm like, this is going to be way harder than what I thought I wanted, and more time consuming too. And so, okay, no, that was definitely Chartreuse, because this is definitely yellow. It's so funny, like what perception can do. Oh man. Oh man, okay, and let's do a different orange on each of these since I did mix up two. Let's use the Jacquard orange here with the purple. And I'm planning on using, oh, that is a very pretty orange. I'm planning on using the Fluorescent Safety Orange from Dharma. And you know what? I'm seeing very flame-like colors and the most breaking I've ever observed with the Jacquard orange right here. Because I'm used to seeing tons of breaking with Dharma's Fluorescent Safety Orange. So okay, I wonder if I could have put them in the wrong containers. Maybe I am feeling more breaking here, but what's weird is I would say the Jacquard's one is feeling more yellow, and Dharma's is feeling more like pink to me right now, which I thought that maybe it was the opposite, but I'll have to review the footage. And hopefully I'll be able to read the tiny little label I have in the jar over where I put them. But I reviewed the footage and I absolutely added the wrong dye to the wrong container. I added the Jacquard orange to the container I labeled with a D for Dharma, and the Dharma orange to a jar I labeled with J for Jacquard. This means that the more yellow color on top is the Dharma orange, like I had thought, and which is why I was confused when the colors looked different, because Dharma's orange was yellower to me when I had done the swatches before. Now, since they are mislabeled, and I'm coming to you from the future to tell you this, I will reference these colors wrong throughout the rest of this section, unless past me eventually figures this out. Either way, the important thing is that the yarn looks awesome. And what's funny is I kind of prefer the Jacquard orange a little bit, which really, really has surprised me. But we need to work on this blue, because I need it to stand out more. Now, you can add to Blacklight blue, you can add some turquoise or some other blues, and that will make it stand out more. But, I mean, it shouldn't be completely necessary, because we should, in theory, be able to get more coverage just by using more of that dye. I do really like this, but we're going to have to see how long it's going to take me to get good coverage. So I'm going to flip things around and try to add color to the other side until I'm satisfied with the coverage here. But first, let's do a quick cut. Oh, look at that blue. I still have the overhead lights in here, but oh my gosh, this just excites me every time. Eek! It'll be more dramatic once I remove all ambient light later. Yeah, that took about 10 minutes. So that took some time. But anyway, I think I'm now going to take this over. I keep seeing this white here, but that's part of the tie. Maybe we'll grab a little tiny bit more Chartreuse. And why not? We'll just color in that tie. Just a little bit. I am wiping my fingers over on a yarn mop, but I'm now going to take all of this yarn and sort of bring it over and steam set it for 30 minutes. And you'll notice that I took all that yarn and moved it all in there together. And as for our yarn mop, we're going to try to clean up these powders off of our countertop. And I think we're going to, you know, we may as well just carry on and then see how this goes. Maybe dealing with one at a time will be a little bit faster. The next 3 skeins that I brought out to add color to were the skein that was all by itself with the resist, and then the first 2 that I opened up on camera. But then I continued to go through all 13 bundles. I mean, I keep saying skeins, but each bundle is really a grouping of 10 skeins. And sometimes you can see how the different minis shift from one another, and so the white lines don't line up exactly, but I did my best playing with these colors to apply that pop of color. And this isn't quite the same as when I've speckled and patted this on in the past. I think I did that for the Rainbow Spring mini-series maybe? Or no, the year before that. I did something with the powders tapping. And so this isn't quite giving that effect, but I like what we have. I made sure to wipe the countertop with a yarn mop, and periodically I would put the yarn mop to steam for 10 minutes or so and bring in a different yarn mop to help with the color. So you might see that skein switching out periodically. But I wanted to have as little dye on the counter as possible before I brought over the next skein. Let's wash 300 grams of our neon yarn, and I am adjusting the zip ties as we go in and out, and I'm going to add a little bit of some dish soap as well. The reason why I adjust where the zip ties are is because since we dyed this with a dry dye powder, there could be some powder maybe stuck in the zip ties or something, and so I just try. But I'm not seeing any bleeding, so I'm dancing because that makes me happy. Oh man, sometimes bleeding can be the bane of my existence. But anyway, I'm gonna rinse out this soap, go wash the rest of the yarn off camera, and then hang it up to dry. Oh, I'm so excited. I mean, I thought there was a chance the black could bleed a little bit, or maybe on some of them there could be some like powder that's still on the surface of the yarn, so we might get some bleeding in some of them, but I'm off camera dancing a little jig right now. I mean, there's really no reason to expect these ones to bleed. I needed to win, you know? Sometimes when things don't work out the way you expect other things to work out not the way you expected. So this I expected. This is according to plan. And here is our black tonal yarn next to our other yarn. Now, I lost my notes on how much black I used for each of them, but I do remember I used less when we were dyeing the yarn that had the zip ties on it. And there are areas in here that feel black, but we're not quite as black as we are with, I think, our 2% depth of shade that we have on those tonals. And this could be two reasons. Well, one, we used less black. Two, we had resists, so the dye couldn't access all of the yarn, and that gives us some more pastel gray areas around here. But before we go and look at a subsection of our fluorescent yarn, because that's the yarn that is, I think, the most interesting here today, pop! Oh my gosh, when I turn on the black light, they light up like a Christmas tree. And I mean, I think I'm gonna need to like change the exposure, maybe go in a closet for you to see that better. But there's no fluorescence on those other tonals. Oh my gosh. Here. I'm curious to see if I can do this even with the ambient light. I mean, you can kind of see the glows on camera. It's a little bit less dramatic because there's so much black. Let's go into a closet. Okay, things aren't laid out in exactly the same way. But I'm gonna turn off the light and turn on the black light. And I don't think you can feel the colors, but you can feel the glow. Oh my gosh, that is so unbelievably pretty. That is so, so, so fun. And here, the black looks very, very black. The areas that were a little bit more white are not glowing. Now, I'm trying to look and see. So this isn't quite an experiment that you've been asking for a while, but I did layer on the neon after dyeing the black, and we're not seeing very much fluorescence on top of any of those black areas. And I'll pop in front of the camera to talk a little bit more about that. It's not that the black dye molecules are physically covering up the fluorescent molecules. It's that those dyes are still there, they're still accessible to the light. It's just the black dyes are absorbing the light, and so we can't see that fluorescence. Unlike paint or something which has opaque layers, Dyes are additive, and so whenever you dye something with one color, you tend to be able to see a little bit of the previous color through it. If we zoom in on a region here, and here is some orange, you can see maybe like a hint of some of the color where the black starts to form. But then if I turn on the white light, you can see a little bit more. There is orange going on either side. And the black, the depth of shade of the black, looks darker in some areas, lighter in some areas. But again, the area that's glowing are those areas where you have the most white. Once you have some of that black there, you're just getting less glow. And so I know that I overshot the areas, and with the Blacklight blue, like I can feel a hint of something on those areas, but really you need the black to be absent in order to see the fluorescence. And here, I mean, there are a tiny bit of areas where it almost feels like there could be little speckles, but I have a feeling if I come super, super close, they're not glowing the same way that everything around it is. And so I don't think you can make a fluorescent black by dyeing yarn black and then over dyeing it with a fluorescent dye. However, I do plan to do that experiment someday, just to show things a little bit further. Here are a few other examples from the ones I showed before. I had some issues with my resists, and that made it really hard to apply the dye on after. In fact, I think this is an area that it felt like it failed completely, and so I didn't add color there because I couldn't see it. I was like, oh, there's only 4 points. Because when wet, those other areas were dark enough that I didn't try to add the fluorescent color. I should have just been using straight dye powder. When at the end I ran out, and I think this was off camera, when I ran out of some of that citric acid dye that I mixed with colors, I just went straight for the jar, and it was so much easier to spread the color on the area. I think I still had this vision of a speckling technique where I had speckled onto yarn and then tapped it in, and it created stunning colors. The issue is that since I wanted the color in such a small area, that didn't work very well. Now, is this yarn beautiful and fun? Yes. Unquestionably, did we create some fun colorways here? It's just, I think I would go about a lot of this project differently. Making sure my zip ties were on tighter. Maybe have acid in the dye bath when adding the yarn to the black, so that way we had deeper patches versus some gray, which affected some of the colors. But overall, I do really love how this came out, even if our black here is not quite as black as the black of our tonals. We'll see everything twisted up next to each other shortly. And here are the yarn mops. I love the contrast between the grays, and then we have our more like peach backdrop from what was left over from some of those blacks. Now, we actually do have 4 different yarn bases here. We have Crazy 8 DK, Platinum DK, Swish Worsted, and then Platinum Sock. And there's not a lot that we can read into the difference between the bases because the background color was different and they're all yarn mops. But I'm happy to see some blue in there, but mostly the sort of purples and yellows are what show through the most. Lights off, fluorescence on. Oh, it's subtle, but oh, you can see the blue. Oh, you can see the blue. And it's funny because the blue barely shows up. Okay, let me zoom in. Okay, you know what? You can see the blue in there. But when we turn on the black light, oh, the blues are popping more. Oh my gosh. Like, it's so subtle. And then you see like a lot of the like party of speckles. Oh, that's so pretty. Ugh, I just adore it. Not that everyone has a black light or looks at things under a black light, but it's just fun. And this goes to show that you can have some fluorescence show up on top of black, but you can't have the black be that saturated. And so this is working, and we see this fluorescence here on the gray. It's just if it's very black, then it didn't work. And once again, I don't think the order of operations, it looks like splatter paint. That's so fun. I don't think the order of operations matters a ton. I think that the the most important thing when dealing with this is just how much of that deeper color there is. But this is so fun. Eek! When you see the yarn twisted up, you can get a feel of how these little pops of neon color might be randomly flecked throughout the black, depending on what you're making. But I think it's also fairly apparent that this black is darker than this black. It's noticeable, but the contrast isn't so bad. Here I have them laid out every other. And there are elements of our variegated yarn that are just as black, but there are also areas that are lighter. So I think they could be mixed together. The thing here that I find interesting is sometimes when I twist yarn up, I love it even more. And other times, I think it's hard to tell what's going on. And this is one of the times it's a little hard to tell what's going on. The way the colors are clustered, it's hard to know if the neon pops are evenly distributed or if there is one long section of color and a lot of black. And so I think that that is just could be a little challenging to distinguish. And it's a big reason why I advocate in a shop to always have a flat lay of the yarn in addition to it twisted up. I mean, obviously, if you can provide swatches are fantastic to help the customer. But as a small batch dyer, I know that I personally don't always have the capacity to show off swatches of all of the yarn that I dye. But I know that personally, as a small batch dyer, I don't always have the capacity to show off swatches of all the yarn that I dye. So a flat lay and the yarn twisted are some ways to help see how like the colors go together, but also get a feel of what the color looks like as it was dyed. So then you know, oh, okay, this is how it may or may not pool. Like this is how big each of the color sections are and their order and things like that. Sometimes I have an idea of how I want to film something and it works perfectly, exactly as I expected. Other times, it may not come out according to plan, but we can still end up with something really, really beautiful. And I gave some notes along the way about how I might adjust this in the future if I wanted to have a slightly different result. But I do really love the yarn that I ended up with tonight. One of my favorite parts about dyeing yarn is letting the dyes in the yarn speak to me a little bit and to see sort of where they want to go versus trying to force the yarn to go in a direction where maybe that's just not what's in the cards for the day. It's a lot of fun. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos. Every night of Chanukah, there will be a new yarn dyeing video coming out at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Plus, we're going to have some videos that go beyond the last night of Chanukah. And then we have our regular scheduled programming with lots of yarn dyeing content, and you don't want to miss any of it. While you're at it, please give a thumbs up and leave a comment down below. This is the best way you can help support the content here, but if you're looking for other ways, I do have a Patreon and an Etsy shop, ChemKnits Creations, where there might still be some Chanukah samplers or other Chanukah yarn that you can go and check out. You can find links to everything down in the video description. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and what do you think will be coming up for Chanukah Night 3? I love hearing your predictions before I go and schedule the next premiere. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow night.